Good morning and welcome to our Future of Hollywood conference. I'm Teddy Downey, executive editor here at the Capitol Forum. Thanks for joining us. This is our first time out in LA and we're pleased to have a big crowd today. And we have a full discussion ahead with an outstanding group of speakers from government, industry, academia, and journalism. For those not familiar with the Capitol Forum, I just want to touch on briefly who we are, why we're hosting this conference, and we're hoping to do this annually from now on. We launched in Washington, D.C. 15 years ago with the vision of being an investigative journalism company focused on competition policy. And maybe the best way to understand that for people in LA is imagine last week tonight, but nerdier, not funny, and focus entirely on monopolies. That's the Capitol Forum. And we think now is really the perfect time to start this kind of conference in LA. The movie and TV industries historically have been protected from monopoly domination by laws preventing vertical integration and media consolidation. Now, however, the industry faces consolidation and also the threat of AI, with some tech companies arguing that vast copying and reproduction of copyrighted works for their own monetization is fair and not a violation of law. And further, the business of Hollywood is being upended by a dominant player, Netflix. And one thing, if I'm just gonna have any influence at all over some of the things we think about during this conference, I like to be a little philosophical about the current moment. And there's a philosopher, Thi Nguyen, who's author of a book called The Score, How to Stop Playing Somebody Else's Game. And he has described Netflix as being in the business of addiction, not art. He also questions whether or not we lose some of our humanity when we outsource our values and our choices to an algorithm. And so that's all to say that Hollywood is at an inflection point, and law enforcers, policymakers, business leaders, and citizens through voting and action in your community will make choices that determine what happens in this industry. And so our role at the Capitol Forum is to study those choices in depth, inform the decision makers, and create some transparency around the decision-making process, and put together forums like this where we can discuss how policy decisions shape markets. And so with that, I would love to introduce our first speaker. We're honored to have someone who has been at the center of modern antitrust enforcement. Doha Mekki previously served as Assistant Attorney General and Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Antitrust Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she helped oversee the division's civil and criminal enforcement efforts and played a key role in merger review and competition policy across a range of industries. She now serves as Senior Fellow at UC Berkeley School of Law, focusing on competition policy and economic justice. Please give AAG Mekki a warm welcome. One issue on everyone's mind right now is, you left DOJ in January 2025. Can you explain to us what has been going on at the DOJ and the Antitrust Division particularly? And maybe this recent Live Nation settlement is a good entree into what's been happening over there.
Great, we're just going to jump right into it.
Yeah.
Okay. First, thank you to the Capitol Forum for having me. And one clarification, I was the former acting AAG, and so I have some sense of the hometown industry. I was just acting. I was not the Senate confirmed. That's my joke. That's it. Okay. So I spent 10 years at the Justice Department working on antitrust cases, and I've seen a lot policing a $29 trillion industry, worked for Republicans, worked for Democrats, And I made myself in charge of the outbound transition, and so had some sense of what was coming with the second Trump administration. And I think there's been a lot of evolution over the last 14 months. To sort of start in December of 2024, you saw the president announce his antitrust picks to lead the agencies. Before some sub-cabinet level picks, you saw them retain the merger guidelines, retain the HSR forms, commit to keeping big tech merger, big tech cases, sort of suggest that they were going to be vigorous in their antitrust enforcement. But really, in practice, we've seen big steps back in antitrust enforcement. Over at the DOJ, we've really seen extraordinary events. We've seen the removal of antitrust officials, first the principal deputy and a top deputy overseeing civil merger enforcement. The removal of the Senate-confirmed Assistant Attorney General herself. We've seen the resignations of career officials and other people who were, we've seen the removal of a collective group of people who were tasked with overseeing the agency, and a lot of learned wisdom and really, extraordinary coddling of lawbreaking. You see mergers being cleared, and if you believe the pages of the Wall Street Journal, you see second requests that should have been issued, but weren't being issued under extraordinary circumstances. The Justice Department did not block except one merger, and that is currently the subject of a Tunney Act proceeding, which is a sunlight measure, and that is going on in the Northern District. I mean, these are really extraordinary circumstances. And then you see the dismissal of cases that were brought during the Biden administration, and then the one case that the Trump administration brought, again, is the subject of fairly serious and extraordinary corruption allegations. That is extraordinary. And then there's the Live Nation case, which I had a hand in bringing, which might be the most popular antitrust case in history. It was brought by the Justice Department with 40 state attorneys general, Republicans and Democrats. It was filed in the Southern District of New York with a very fast time to trial. There was a jury demand, and so that makes it unusual for a Justice Department case. And the allegations, there are many of them, it's over 100 pages, but the core of it is that Live Nation has a massive flywheel, and the core of it is that it sits at the ownership or control of venues, promotion, control of artists, control of management. Really, it controls the ecosystem of live music and uses a variety of levers to extract its dominance and control of money in this ecosystem. The documents are extraordinary, but right around late fall or so, there are whispers, right, that you hear in the press that there might be a settlement in the case, which again is extraordinary because there's a long history of failed settlements involving Live Nation, right, including the merger that brought us Live Nation and Ticketmaster. And then there's the removal of the Senate-confirmed head of the Antitrust Division. Ostensibly, and again, these are allegations, I don't know what is what, but I'm a private citizen now reading what is reported. The removal of the Senate-confirmed head of the Antitrust Division is allegedly tied to this case. And the case nonetheless goes to trial, and over a week, there are documents that are presented to witnesses and they're examined about retaliation and threats. And then, in the second week of trial, what should have been the second week of trial, a settlement is announced. And the judge is furious. And the lead trial lawyer says, I have never seen this term sheet. And the states say we knew nothing about this. And that brings us to our current circumstances.
And so I think maybe one way to talk about what's happening in terms of federal enforcement, at least compared to when you were there, is there's a little bit of a vacuum, a little bit of a enforcement vacuum. And what role do the states, obviously we're going to hear shortly from AG Banta, but what role do the states play when you see this sort of enforcement drop off at the federal level?
Yeah, so look, when you see the federal government stepping back in extraordinary ways, it helps to think about the US enforcement landscape in the way that Congress did, at least in 1890. You can design an antitrust enforcement scheme in a lot of different ways. You can vest enforcement just at the federal level. You could do it just at the state level. You could make it exclusively a private right of action. And Congress was so concerned with antitrust enforcement that it actually vested that authority in all of those places. So, we have actually 2 enforcement agencies, which doesn't always make everyone happy, even the federal enforcers, right? And every single state in the country has a mini version of the federal statute, and in some cases goes off and creates its own authorities to strengthen antitrust enforcement. And I think the states have to be willing to stand in the breach and speak up for this really important public economic law, particularly in this moment when there is chaos and confusion at the federal level. States have to be, I think, willing to reprise this role of speaking for their citizens, right? I mean, how long have people been saying, Live Nation is ripping people off, right? I think there were documents that were unsealed yesterday where Live Nation executives were sort of laughing to one another about just how well they were ripping people off, like feeling badly, but also seeming to laugh about charging people for parking fees and gouging them. I think they might have used the word gouging, right? That's extraordinary. That's extraordinary. And so when faced with a crappy settlement, and that's what it is, it's a crappy settlement, I think the states have to go forward. And I think this kind of situation is going to present itself many, many times over the next several years. And I should say, this is not really a partisan issue. I think Republican AGs have often done the best job of standing up for the rights of citizens in their states. I think Texas is a model, in fact. I had a hand in bringing the federal Google ad tech case, and it never escaped my attention that when General Paxton brought his case, the Texas legislature actually appropriated funds specifically for the Attorney General's office to go litigate that case. That is a model of democracy. And I think other states should be looking at that kind of enforcement and actually ensuring there are appropriate resources where there are important state interests at play.
And, we've got a Hollywood audience here dealing with big tech. You famously fought a lot of battles against big tech while you were at the AG's office. What lessons did you learn from that fight? And what advice do you have for Hollywood in terms of avoiding the same fate as the news and music industries?
Yeah, the tech fights are still going, but they offer a few important lessons. The first is that trials matter for their own sake. There's a role for settlements, no doubt. They can be efficient. They can avoid cost and surprises, and I understand that. But public economic laws, and there really aren't that many of them in the grand scheme of things, also vindicate important rights. And when you are talking about economic liberties, which in my view are a backstop for other important rights, affording the public the opportunity to examine for themselves how their opportunities in the marketplace are being discussed, and especially in the context of jury trials, right, giving citizens the opportunity to make decisions about issues that affect them, that is really important, right? In my experience, and I've won cases and lost cases in front of juries, you cannot dupe the American people. You might be able to convince like one person or get like one thing past like one person, but you cannot get something past like 12 people, right? They are very good at disciplining government overreach, right? And so when the government is willing to put their case voluntarily before a jury, I think that is really important and really demonstrates a confidence and a willingness to subject their own decision making before the public. So I think that's one thing, right? That public trials matter, especially jury trials. The second thing is to keep an eye on issues like retaliation. And again, thinking about Live Nation, thinking about tech issues, thinking about some macro issues that are in the news today. When you're thinking about enforcement, when you're thinking about prosecution, when you're thinking about discharging these authorities that are entrusted to us. We live in the United States, right? Power comes from the people. You have to remember that the ordinary person cannot easily vindicate all of their liberties. And it is not okay to say, well, if the government settles a case or doesn't bring a case, private actors can just go hire their own lawyer. Because retaliation is real. And that is the theme of the Live Nation complaint. That is a theme in a lot of the tech complaints. The fear of coercion, the fear of being squeezed out of economic opportunity, those people are left vulnerable. The federal government leaving witnesses high and dry, leaving them vulnerable to being tormented by their bullies, is extraordinary. And that is an issue that we see everywhere from like the victims of the Epstein files all the way down to the Live Nation case, where you have venue operators who talk about the fear of getting sideways with Live Nation, if they tried to use another promoter or didn't sell or whatever the case was.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, one of the things I've been shocked by the most is how afraid people are to speak publicly. At this conference, we had a lot of people drop out because they're in contract negotiations or there's some other fear of retaliation. It was pretty surprising, really. So I want to stay on that labor issue for a moment. We're going to talk about the antitrust specifically on mergers in a bit. But you did a lot of work on labor markets when you were at DOJ. How do you think about the labor impact of consolidation generally, this Paramount deal, synergies in that deal, things like that in this market?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about labor markets at DOJ. First in the criminal context, with no poach and wage fixing cases, but then really building out the rest of our understanding in the civil context, whether it was non-competes or information sharing or like the theory of monopsony, which is really just like abuses of bargaining leverage, just to like distill it to its core parts. And in the merger context, I was really proud that we filed the Penguin Random House Simon & Schuster case, which was a merger challenge that was really about two book publishers that wanted to combine. And I think when that case was announced, you might have thought the Justice Department would have been concerned that, I don't know, fewer books would have been published or something if they had gotten together, but that was not in fact the theory. The concern was that if the two combined, that advances for authors would actually go down, and that advances for, like the spectacular books, right? The advances above like $250,000 or so would actually become more meager. And that was a really fun trial to put together. The first witness in the case actually was Stephen King. And there was this moment, I remember in the courtroom when he was sworn. And the first question is always, please state your name and your profession. He said, my name is Steve King and I'm an author. And there was this moment where everyone kind of laughed because this famous man sort of just reduced himself to that. But over the course of the trial, we just heard from many, many agents who talked about all of the voices and all of the ideas that never would have made it into the marketplace of ideas if people wouldn't have been able to live off of those advances, and what it meant for Penguin and Simon & Schuster to offer those advances. And that's really important. And so, I've seen the writing and elements of that that came up when Warner was on the auction block, whether it was Netflix or Paramount that was going to get it. And I've seen some of that, like more of that. And now that it looks like Paramount is going to clinch the deal. Look, I think that ultimately the analysis of the deal will rise and fall on, sort of core antitrust analysis. On the studio side, I see that there's a lot of studios. Is there a closeness of competition on the acquisition side? I don't know. I don't know what the documents say. What I do know is you need witnesses to tell those stories, right? You need people to say, listen, there's a closeness about these two companies. You need like a market. You need like some like theory of like exhibition where they compete particularly closely, right? Like some group that's particularly affected. That's not a political question. That's not a social question. That's just kind of labor economics, right? And that's plain vanilla, but it's an important question. So I will be curious to see how it plays out.
Yeah, we're gonna get a lot of discussion about that shortly. I think you mentioned we've already touched on this a little bit, but what do you think is special about Hollywood, as a market? What is being produced? You policed a $29 trillion economy for monopoly issues. You mentioned books. Obviously, that plays an important role as a market, but also in a functioning democracy. Do you see that similarly for movies and TV? How do you think about Hollywood as an important market?
Yeah. So one of my favorite antitrust cases is this 1953 Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court talks about how, the goal of our antitrust laws unquestionably is competition. The court sort of extrapolates out and says, there are these second order and third order benefits that you get from competition. And the second order and third order benefits sort of accrue to these other goals. And those goals are really conductive to the preservation of our democratic institutions and our social and political goals. And again, there's nuance there, right? It's antitrust is not about a pursuit of non-economic goals, but if you just focus on the core competition theory, there are second order benefits, right? So we're all following with me, right? So Hollywood is interesting, and I think especially for someone like me who, I came to this country when I was 4, because, the stories that we tell about ourselves are part of our identity, and our national ability to tell those stories. They're so important. When we were looking at some of the tech cases, and I won't identify the companies, we heard stories about companies that were really obsequious to, we'll just say, investors in foreign countries, China, and, would impose these limitations on the kinds of stories that people could tell. And I thought that was so alarming. I thought that was extraordinarily sad. And, I fell in love with this place through music and television and movies. And that makes Hollywood different from, industrials or, timber, right? Or a commodities market or something. And they're all really important, right? But, I'm just a nerd from DC, here to tell you guys that you should protect this market with everything you have. You should not let it go the way of tech, where every force of a platform is to drive the cost of content acquisition down to zero, right? And they wade in the morass of advertising and just how to monetize, right? But these stories are independently valuable, right? And they matter hugely for the entire rest of the country. So you guys should totally figure this out, and don't sit around and wait for some kingmaker to figure it out.
Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Give Rob some remarks.